This content presents World War II historical events for educational purposes only, based on documented records to honor those who served and provide historical insight. This does not glorify violence, promote hatred, or spread misinformation. Viewer discretion advised.
They pulled me from the front lines in the spring of 1944. No explanation given, just orders typed on faded paper, handed to me by a captain whose eyes held secrets he'd never speak. I thought I was being reassigned to another infantry unit, maybe punished for something I couldn't remember doing. Instead, I found myself in a warehouse outside Dover, surrounded by men who looked as confused as I felt. We were soldiers without a war, or so it seemed. The irony wouldn't reveal itself until much later, when I understood that we were about to fight the most crucial battle of the invasion, one that would never see a single bullet fired in anger. The briefing room smelled of cigarette smoke and uncertainty. A British officer with a clipped accent and tired eyes stood before us, his words carefully measured. "Gentlemen, you are now part of something that doesn't exist. You will build an army that isn't real. You will threaten an invasion that will never come." I remember looking around at the other faces, searching for understanding in their expressions, finding only the same bewilderment that gnawed at my own gut. We were being asked to become ghosts, to inhabit a phantom force that would draw the enemy's gaze away from the truth. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like wet sand. What they were asking seemed impossible, absurd even. We would create fake radio traffic, simulate the movements of entire divisions, construct inflatable tanks and wooden artillery pieces. We would become actors in the greatest theater production ever staged, with an audience of German intelligence officers and reconnaissance pilots. The success of the real invasion, they told us, depended entirely on our ability to convince the enemy that we were the main threat. Lives would be saved or lost, based on how well we could lie without speaking a word. I signed papers that day that swore me to secrecy, documents that felt heavier than any rifle I'd ever carried. The training began immediately, and with it came the realization that deception was an art as complex as warfare itself. We learned to mimic the radio signatures of tank battalions, to create the electromagnetic footprint of a massive army preparing for invasion. We studied the patterns of real military communications, the rhythms and protocols that would make our phantom force seem authentic. Every detail mattered because somewhere across the channel, German analysts were listening, watching, trying to divine where the hammer would fall. We were painting a picture with lies, and every brushstroke had to be perfect. At night, lying in my bunk, I wondered about the morality of what we were doing. War had always been straightforward in my mind, a matter of shooting straight and following orders. But this was different. This was psychological warfare, a manipulation of reality itself. We were creating a fiction so convincing that men would die because of it. German soldiers who would be in the wrong place at the wrong time because they believed in the army we were conjuring from nothing. The burden of that knowledge made sleep difficult, but I learned to carry it. We all did, because we understood that sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in facing the enemy, but in becoming the lie that protects the truth. The fields of Kent transformed into a military staging ground that existed only in the enemy's imagination. We worked through rain and sunshine, erecting the elaborate facade of an invasion force. Inflatable tanks took shape under our hands, rubber and canvas constructs that from the air looked as real as steel and armor. We positioned them in precise formations, the kind that real tank battalions would adopt before a major offensive. Each placement was calculated, designed to tell a story to the reconnaissance planes that flew overhead, their cameras clicking away, gathering the evidence We wanted them to gather. The wooden artillery pieces were works of art in their own way, constructed with care and attention to detail that would have made any carpenter proud. We painted them, weathered them, even created fake track marks in the mud around them to simulate movement and activity. From 500 feet up, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. I remember standing back one afternoon, looking at our creation, feeling a strange pride mixed with unease. We had built a military force from imagination and craft supplies, a Potemkin village on a scale never before attempted. The absurdity of it should have been laughable, but instead it felt deadly serious. The tent city sprawled across the countryside, row after row of canvas structures that housed no one. We installed lights-on timers to create the illusion of occupation, strung communication wires between empty command posts, even hung laundry on lines to simulate the domestic details of a real military encampment. Every morning we would change small details, morph vehicles, rearrange equipment, creating the dynamic quality of a living army. The Germans were watching, we knew, and their cameras would pick up these changes, these signs of activity that would convince them we were real. We became stagehands in a production where the audience could never be allowed to see behind the curtain. The radio work was perhaps the most delicate part of our deception. Operators sat in trucks and tents, maintaining a constant stream of communications that mimicked the traffic of real military units. They used the correct call signs, the proper protocols, the authentic jargon of Army communications. Sometimes they would simulate radio silence, the kind that would precede a major operation, knowing that silence itself was a message the Germans would interpret. We created the electromagnetic signature of an army group preparing to strike at Patton, a shorter crossing point that military logic would suggest as the obvious target for invasion. Every transmission was a thread in the tapestry of our lie. I drove trucks loaded with inflatable tanks to new positions, feeling the lightness of the cargo that should have weighed tons. The disconnect between appearance and reality became surreal after a while. We were living in a world of shadows and smoke, where nothing was as it seemed, and everything was exactly as we needed it to appear. Local civilians were kept at a distance, forbidden from approaching our installations. Those who caught glimpses of our work from afar saw what they expected to see: a massive military force preparing for the liberation of Europe. They couldn't know they were looking at the greatest magic trick ever performed, an illusion that would help save thousands of lives on beaches they'd never heard of, called Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. When General Patton arrived, everything changed. His presence added a layer of credibility to our phantom army that no amount of fake tanks could achieve. The Germans feared him, respected his tactical genius, and believed he would lead the main invasion force. That's exactly what made him perfect for our purposes. Watching him stride through our fake installations, I understood the psychological brilliance of the operation. We weren't just creating a false army, we were giving it a face the enemy would recognize and fear. Patton played his role with characteristic intensity, visiting our positions, inspecting our rubber tanks as if they were real armor. German spies in England reported his movements, and those reports filtered back to Berlin, adding weight to the deception. He gave speeches to gatherings of officers, knowing that loose lips in pubs and restaurants would carry word of his presence in southeastern England. Every public appearance was calculated, designed to reinforce the fiction that the 1st U.S. Army Group, stationed in Kent and Essex, would be the spearhead of the invasion across the Strait of Dover. I stood in formation once when he addressed us, and even knowing the truth, I felt the force of his personality. He told us we were soldiers in the most important battle of the war, And he wasn't lying. Our weapons weren't guns and tanks, but guile and deception. The enemy would deploy divisions to counter us, divisions that wouldn't be present when the real invasion came. Every German soldier staring at the Pas-de-Calais coast because of our work would be a soldier not defending the beaches of Normandy. The mathematics of deception were brutal and beautiful in their simplicity. The general's presence brought additional scrutiny to our operation, but also additional protection. The cover story became more elaborate, the security more intense. We were forbidden from discussing anything about our real work, even among ourselves when off duty. The compartmentalization was absolute. Most of us knew only our small piece of the larger puzzle, though we could guess at the shape of the whole. Patton became the linchpin of our deception, the famous name that would draw the enemy's attention exactly where we needed it. His reputation was a weapon as powerful as any we'd wielded. Watching him leave after one of his inspections, jeep disappearing down a country road lined with fake supply dumps and empty barracks, I felt the full weight of what we were attempting. We were betting everything on the enemy's predictable response to what they thought they were seeing. If they discovered the truth, if even one aspect of our deception unraveled, the real invasion could face catastrophic resistance. But intelligence reports filtering down through channels suggested the Germans were buying what we were selling. They believed in our phantom army. They believed Patton would lead the charge at Fortitude, and that belief, more than any actual military force, would determine the fate of D. May turned to June, and the tension became unbearable. We maintained our routines, our radio traffic, our careful orchestration of a false reality, but we knew something was coming, could feel it in the air like static before a storm. The real invasion force was gathering somewhere beyond our knowledge, preparing for assault we could only imagine. Our job was to keep the enemy's eyes fixed on us, to remain the credible threat that pinned German divisions in place while history unfolded elsewhere. The nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, wondering if what we were doing was working, if German commanders were really falling for our elaborate ruse. There was no way to know for certain, no feedback loop that would tell us if our performance was convincing. We operated on faith, trust in the intelligence officers who had designed this operation, belief that our painstaking work was serving its purpose. The uncertainty gnawed at our soul, though we rarely spoke of it. We just kept inflating our tanks, broadcasting our fake messages, playing our roles in a drama whose climax we might never witness. Orders came down to increase our activity in early June. More radio traffic, more visible movement of equipment, more signs of an imminent operation. We understood what this meant, even if no one said it explicitly. The real invasion was approaching, and we needed to reach a crescendo of apparent preparation. We worked with renewed intensity, knowing that somewhere across the channel, German commanders were receiving reports of our activities, making decisions about where to position their forces. The fate of thousands of soldiers hung on whether those commanders believed in the reality of our illusion. I remember June 5th particularly well. The weather had been terrible, rain and wind that seemed to match the nervous energy running through all of us. We went through our usual routines, but everything felt different, charged with anticipation. That night, lying in the darkness, I heard the sound of aircraft, wave after wave of them flying overhead toward the south. The sound went on for hours, a mechanical thunder that spoke of something massive unfolding. We weren't supposed to know what it meant, but we weren't stupid. Somewhere, tonight, men were going into battle. The next morning, Juni 6 news filtered through unofficial channels. The invasion had begun, but not at Pas-de-Calais, Normandy. Beaches with code names that would become legendary, and our fake army in Kent and Essex, still a threat in the minds of German commanders, still pinning down divisions that could have reinforced the actual invasion beaches. We had succeeded beyond measure, though we wouldn't learn the full extent of our success for weeks to come. Our phantom force continued its elaborate dance, maintaining the deception even after D-Day, keeping the enemy guessing about a second invasion that would never materialize. Weeks passed after D-Day, and we maintained our ghost army, our radio chatter, our careful illusion. The Germans kept significant forces at Pas-de-Calais for weeks, convinced that the Normandy landings were a feint, that the real invasion would still come from our direction. Every day they waited for us was another day. The Allied forces in Normandy could consolidate their beachhead, push inland, establish supply lines. We had become the most successful military unit that never fired a shot, the army that won by not existing. Intelligence reports began to trickle down to us, carefully sanitized but revealing enough. The deception had worked better than anyone had dared hope. Hitler himself had been convinced that Patton would lead the main invasion, and had held back the panzer divisions that could have driven the Normandy invasion back into the sea. Those tanks and troops waited for us for an army of rubber and radio waves, while real soldiers fought and died and ultimately prevailed on beaches 80 miles to the west. The magnitude of what we had accomplished was staggering and humbling in equal measure. But there was a darkness to the revelation as well. We learned that our success meant German soldiers had died in the wrong place, defending against a threat that didn't exist, while the real battle raged elsewhere. The moral complexity of what we had done settled over me like a fog. We had saved Allied lives, yes, but we had done so through deception on a scale that felt almost mythological. I thought about the German commanders who had believed our lie, who had made tactical decisions based on faulty intelligence we had carefully crafted. They had been out-hot, outmaneuvered, deceived so completely that their own competence had worked against them. As summer progressed and the Allied breakout from Normandy became a rout, our mission began to wind down. The inflatable tanks were deflated, the wooden artillery pieces dismantled. We packed up the props of our elaborate theater production, and the fields of Kent returned to their normal state. It felt anticlimactic, this quiet ending to what had been the most intense months of my life. There were no medals for what we had done, no public recognition. The operation remained classified, a secret that we carried with us. As we were reassigned to regular units, I was eventually sent to the continent, joining the advance through France as a regular infantryman again. The transition was jarring, going from psychological warfare back to the straightforward brutality of combat. But I carried with me the knowledge of what we had accomplished, the understanding that warfare was evolving into something more complex than bullets and blood. We had proven that in modern conflict, perception could be as important as firepower, that the enemy's mind was a battlefield, as crucial as any physical terrain. The soldiers who survived D-Day because German reinforcements arrived too late never knew about us, about the phantom army that had protected them. That anonymity was part of the mission, and I accepted it, though it sometimes felt like carrying a secret too large for one person to hold. The war ended, and I came home to a world that celebrated the heroes of D-Day, the paratroopers and the beach assault troops, the men who had faced the Atlantic Wall with courage and blood. I stood among the crowds at victory parades, watching veterans march past, and I wondered what they would think if they knew about Operation Fortitude. Would they understand the strange pride I felt in having been part of something so unconventional, so divorced from traditional notions of military valor? Or would they see it as somehow less worthy, a trick rather than a battle? The oath of secrecy I had sworn bound me to silence for decades. I couldn't tell my family where I had really been, what I had actually done during those crucial months of 1944. When people asked about my war service, I gave vague answers, deflected questions, let them assume I had been just another soldier in just another unit. The frustration of that silence was profound, like carrying a stone in my chest that I could never set down. I had been part of something historically significant, something that had changed the course of the war, and I couldn't speak of it. Years passed, and the world moved on. The Cold War brought new conflicts, new forms of deception and psychological operations. I wondered sometimes if our techniques from Operation Fortitude were being used again, refined and adapted for new enemies. The military-industrial complex grew more sophisticated, and I recognized in its development the lessons learned from our success. Deception had proven its value, and I knew it would remain a tool of warfare forever after. We had opened a door that could never be closed. As I grew older, I watched documentaries about D-Day, read histories of the invasion, saw the beaches where so many had died. The historians discussed Allied deception operations in careful, sanitized terms, never fully revealing the scope of what had been done. I knew the full story, or at least my small part of it, and the knowledge was both a burden and a strange comfort. I had been there, had been part of the machine that made victory possible, even if no one could ever know my specific contribution. The weight of untold stories is a peculiar thing. It shapes you in ways that are hard to articulate, creates a separation between your public self and your private knowledge. I became comfortable with that duality over time, learned to live with the secret history I carried. But there were moments, usually late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, when I desperately wanted to speak, to tell anyone about the Phantom Army in the fields of Kent, about the inflatable tanks and the wooden gants, about the greatest lie ever told in the service of truth. Those moments passed, as they always did, and the secret remained locked away, protected by oath and classification. Decades after the war, Operation Fortitude was finally declassified. The world learned about the Ghost Army, about the deception that had protected the D-Day invasion. I watched news reports with a complicated mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the story could finally be told, that the men who had served in that strange unit could finally speak of their service. Sadness that so many of my comrades hadn't lived to see this day, had died with the secret still locked inside them. I began to speak about my experiences, carefully at first, then more freely, as I realized people were genuinely interested in this forgotten chapter of the war. The questions came fast and furious. What was it like to build a fake army? Did we really think it would work? How did it feel knowing that lives depended on how well we could lie? It wasn't cowardice or trickery, but a different kind of courage. The courage to trust in strategy over strength, in minds over might. Some understood, others remained skeptical. But I kept telling the story because it deserved to be told. I connected with other veterans of Operation Fortitude, men I hadn't seen since 1944. We shared memories, compared notes, filled in gaps in each other's knowledge. It was healing in a way I hadn't expected, this late-life brotherhood with men who understood the unique experience we had shared. We had been ghosts together, had inhabited a phantom force that changed history, and now we could finally acknowledge that bond publicly. The relief of that recognition after so many years of silence was profound. Looking back across 8 decades of life, I can see how Operation Fortitude shaped me in ways I only dimly understood at the time. It taught me that reality is more malleable than we like to think, that perception and truth are not always the same thing. It showed me that courage takes many forms, that sometimes the greatest impact comes not from direct action, but from subtle manipulation of circumstances. These lessons served me well in civilian life, in business and relationships, and the daily negotiations of existence. The war ended, but the wisdom gained from those months of deception remained, a foundation on which I built the rest of my life. Now, at the end of my days, I feel compelled to leave this testimony, this record of what we did and why it mattered. Operation Fortitude was more than just a military deception. It was a demonstration of human ingenuity, of our capacity to think beyond conventional solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems. We faced an enemy that controlled the Atlantic Wall, that had years to fortify and prepare, and we defeated them not with superior force but with superior cunning. The young soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, many of them are gone now, passed into history and memory. But their sacrifice was made less costly because of what we did, because German reinforcements arrived too late or not at all, because the enemy's attention was divided, their certainty shaken. I think about those soldiers often, about the ones who lived because our phantom army was convincing enough, skilled enough, lucky enough to pull off the greatest con in military history. Their survival was our medal, our recognition. Even if they never knew our names, the world has changed so much since those days in the fields of Kent. Warfare has become more technological, more precise, more distant. But the principles of deception remain constant. Even now, militaries around the world study Operation Fortitude, learning from our successes and our near misses, adapting our techniques for modern conflicts. The Ghost Army has become a case study, a teaching tool, a legend. Sometimes I wonder if current soldiers understand that behind the legend were just regular men, scared and uncertain, doing their best to fulfill an impossible mission. I want people to understand that war is not just about courage under fire, though that matters enormously. It's also about the unglamorous work of logistics and intelligence and, yes, deception. It's about the soldiers who never fire a shot, but whose contribution is nonetheless vital. Operation Fortitude succeeded because ordinary men committed fully to an extraordinary task, maintaining discipline and attention to detail even when the purpose wasn't entirely clear, trusting that their work served a greater good. As I write these final words, I think about the young man I was in 1944, standing in that warehouse in Dover, listening to a British officer tell us we would become ghosts. I couldn't have imagined then that this experience would define my life, would be the thing I was most proud of when I looked back across all my years. We were part of something larger than ourselves, something that demonstrated humanity's capacity for cleverness and cooperation in the face of existential threat. The Phantom Army existed for only a few months, but its impact echoes through history. A reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the space between perception and reality. The story of Operation Fortitude matters today more than ever. In an age of misinformation and digital deception, understanding how perception shapes reality is crucial. We live in a world where truth and lies blend seamlessly, where the battleground is often the human mind rather than physical terrain. The lessons learned in those fields of Kent in 1944 resonate in our modern conflicts, both military and civilian. I challenge you to think critically about what you see and hear, to question the narratives presented to you, to understand that reality is often more complex than it appears. The same techniques we used to deceive the Germans are employed today in different forms by different actors for different purposes. Recognizing deception is as important now as it was then, perhaps more so in our interconnected, information-saturated world. Share this story with young people, with students of history and military strategy, with anyone who needs to understand that warfare is not just about weapons and soldiers. Let them know about the Phantom Army, about the men who fought with inflatable tanks and radio waves, who won a crucial battle through cunning rather than carnage. These stories need to be told and retold, passed down through generations so that the lessons are never lost. Honor the veterans of unconventional warfare, those who served in intelligence, deception operations, psychological operations, code breaking, and countless other specialties that don't fit the traditional image of military service. Their contributions were no less vital, their courage no less real, even if their battles were fought in shadows rather than sunlight. Every veteran has a story worth hearing, and many of those stories challenge our assumptions about what warfare means. Finally, remember that the greatest victories often come not from strength alone, but from intelligence, creativity, and the courage to attempt something unprecedented. The men and women who conceived and executed Operation Fortitude dared to imagine a solution that had never been tried before, and they pulled it off through meticulous planning and flawless execution. That spirit of innovation in the face of overwhelming odds is something we need in every generation, in every challenge we face as a society. The Phantom Army is gone, dissolved back into history, but its legacy endures. We proved that a well-crafted lie in service of a greater truth can change the world, that knowledge is both empowering and sobering, a reminder of human capability for both good and ill. How we use that knowledge, how we employ the tools of deception and persuasion in our own time, will define our generation just as surely as Operation Fortitude helped define the greatest generation. This is my testimony, my final mission. I pass the torch to you.